Thank you, Earl. Thank you for inviting me. It's been a real treat coming over here and experiencing your fantastic hospitality. And as most of you know, I'm not an Oxfordian, but so I suppose the invitation is extra special. But I am, of course, a non-Stratfordian. I prefer non-Stratfordian to anti-Stratfordian because I'm kind of into reducing conflict, and anti is a sort of combative kind of word. And I'm not really anti anything except inaccuracy on both sides, or all sides indeed. So I want to talk about the value of uncertainty. And I'll be looking at some examples where my uncertainty has taken me and how useful I think it is. It might seem, in the face of entrenched certainty from the mainstream, that Shakespeare wrote the works attributed to him, that you might think that uncertainty is a kind of weak position and that we have to kind of go in guns blazing with our own certainty to combat their certainty. But I'm going to explain why I think uncertainty is a really strong position and that it is to a large degree an important way of going forward and getting Shakespeare's skepticism accepted in academia, and how important I think uncertainty is in that score. So let's just look at what uncertainty does. It's difficult, and I appreciate that, because as humans we like certainty. And the first thing that happens if you suggest to anyone that you think that Shakespeare might not have written the works attributed to him, people go, well, who did? And they just want the answer. And they want to go straight to the certainty. Now, I think that uncertainty allows us to change our minds if necessary and not get overcommitted to a potentially false position. And that's from the biggest part of this, you know, the real kind of, did Shakespeare write Shakespeare? All down to the little details, that little argument that you've made, that tiny bit of evidence that you're interpreting. What I often see in the authorship question is people leaping from one kind of certainty, the certainty that the Stratford man wrote the plays, to the certainty that another candidate did. And for me, this is frying pan to fire. I think holding yourself in uncertainty is going to give you more room for manoeuvre and not get burnt, hopefully. Uncertainty reduces aggression. And anyone who has been involved in the authorship question in any kind of discussion at some point, whether in person and very often online, will have met aggression, personal attack. In fact, this debate can almost be characterized by personal attack. I stay as far out as possible of the discussions. As soon as I see something that's come up where anti-Stratfordians and Stratfordians are engaged in some kind of comment battle, whether it's in the Amazon reviews page or it's the comments section of a newspaper, I just don't read. I just shut it down because it's poison, it's poop, you know, and it doesn't go anywhere. Uncertainty reduces aggression by moving us away from the politics of right and wrong. It takes us closer to the possibility of reasoned debate, the ideal of being able to rationally discuss this question. It is certainty that has led to what's been called this dialogue of the deaf, where neither side can understand the other side's point of view, which is as conducive to communication as speaking different languages. A fine example is the polarity and extremism that occurs online. Here's the Amazon's review page for Shakespeare Beyond Doubt ? Shortly after publication. So these are the most helpful, favourable review, 5 stars, a must read. A must read for all students of Shakespeare. It answers most of the questions regarding did the bard from Stratford write the plays and sonnets. It does not concern itself with who is the actual writer, which is perhaps the more interesting question. However, a great addition to the topic, and the most helpful critical review, 1 star, absolute rubbish. What a pile of absolute rubbish written by a money-grabbing fool. At least it might be of some use if I run out of paper in the lavatory. Now, what is a general reader? And surely it's the general reader we're after. What is a general reader wondering whether to buy this book to think? Non-Stratfordians are at disadvantage here because the public will shy away from anything that looks like a dogfight, and they will defer to those held to be the experts, and that is the orthodox scholars. So here is the question that I am most often asked. Do you believe that Shakespeare didn't write the plays? And sometimes I'm asked, do you believe, or so you believe that Marlowe wrote the plays? And both of these are closed questions. Anyone who's done interview technique, you understand the difference between closed and open questions. It invites two answers, either yes or no. But from here, the conversation can often go no further. So instead, I avoid answering yes or no. I talk instead about the uncertainty generated by the evidence. But I also talk about the different possible interpretations of evidence. And by doing that, I don't make a person who opposes my view wrong necessarily, because no human being wants to be told that they're wrong. And that's why there's so much aggression in this public discussion. We have to remind ourselves this is the Shakespeare authorship question. It is not the Shakespeare authorship solution. Uncertainty makes it easier for people to listen to us and to ask their own questions and to become uncertain themselves. And for that reason, uncertainty is persuasive. And there is another great benefit to fostering our own uncertainty. Our biggest problem is this, the human brain. Not just as authorship doubters, but as human beings. The problem here is confirmation bias. This is what makes Stratfordians certain that everything points to their man, even though it doesn't. But we must be aware that exactly the same thing can happen to us, because it's just the way the human brain is wired. So confirmation bias creates, this is a perception filter. This is a perception filter that once we hold a firm belief, or even more, a knowing that a certain person wrote the plays, whether that be Shakespeare of Stratford, or Oxford, or Bacon, or Marlowe, it puts a perception filter so that only certain things can come through, right? So say we have the perception filter of, as many people in this room do, the 17th Earl of Oxford wrote the plays. If something supports our theory, then we can accommodate it. If something contradicts our theory, more often than not, we won't even see it. And we can, even worse than that, and I've heard quite a lot of this recently, if it doesn't fit, you make it fit, you cram it in, you do something like appropriating Marlowe's works, as I was talking to somebody, so Oxford wrote Marlowe as well, and perhaps some other stuff. So what you have to be aware of is that there is always another interpretation, and you might not have the right one. It might not be the truth. But you can say, I favour this interpretation, this makes sense to me, that's fine, and then you're not making someone else wrong. If we don't recognise that there's always another interpretation, we are sunk. Because our biggest issue right now is to get the question accepted as a valid question in academia. There's a panel on this at the end of this conference. And for the Shakespeare authorship question to become a valid area of scholarship, we need to understand what scholarship really, really is. I think the best definition of scholarship that I know is by Giles Dawson from 1952. Scholarship implies an attitude towards truth and a method of working towards the establishment of truth. The scholar has no axes to grind. He is not eager to prove his own hypotheses correct, but rather to find out whether they are correct or not. When he or she, this is 52, right? when he or she uncovers a fact which does not square with his or her hypotheses, he neither shuts his eyes to it, nor tries to explain it away, nor trims it to fit his own preconceptions, but rather adjusts the hypothesis to fit the facts. Now, we recognise that orthodox Shakespearean scholars do not do this, and that's because they do not accept that Shakespeare's authorship of Shakespeare is a hypothesis. They treat it as a fact, but we must not fall into the same trap. Uncertainty is the scholarly approach. It allows you to look at your own arguments critically and discard the weak ones. And it allows you to look at their arguments seriously and focus on answering them, not just dismissing them out of hand as simply wrong, which is what they do to us, but we must not do it to them. We must say, what if they are right about this particular part of the evidence? They could be right. And if we consider that they might be right on one piece of evidence at a time, then we can find out where our strong arguments are and where our weak arguments are, and vice versa in terms of their research, their study. So this is the real issue. Here's Shakespeare, let's say, and there's the works of Shakespeare. Now, we have this as a hypothesis. The orthodoxy have it as a fact. But we mustn't go down the same route. Now, when I started putting together Shakespeare the Evidence, which is an ongoing online ebook, still growing, plenty more to do, one of the things I decided to do, the way it's structured, and I know some of you own it, have it and read it, which I appreciate, it's all supporting the continued growth of it, but I take each single piece of evidence that's put forward by either side and look at the arguments and the counter-arguments. And by that, determine where our strong suits are. Right, because it's such a huge and complex question. Sifting the wheat from the chaff. And I'm going to just take a few examples just on Shakespeare's local knowledge, where I was looking at the argument that there is local knowledge of the Stratford area in the plays, for example. So looking at Shakespeare's local knowledge, I look at these four things. So a model for Ophelia, and someone mentioned this yesterday. So at Tiddington, Catherine Hamlet, in 1579, drowned in the River Avon, 1 mile from Stratford. So she has been put forward as a model for Ophelia. The idea is that, that when he was rewriting, when the author was rewriting this existing story of Amleth, whether he wrote the Hamlet or not, I'm kind of inclined to think that that was an early draft, but that he was writing this old Danish story, that the name of Hamlet reminded him of this young woman who drowned in the River Avon just a mile from Stratford when he was 15 years old. Now that's been put forward. But there is another model for Ophelia. There is Jane Shakespeare, who also very close to Stratford-upon-Avon. In 1569, when the man from Stratford was 5 years old, she drowned near Stratford, and she was picking flowers, right? This is in the inquest document. She was picking flowers, she slipped into the river, and she drowned. So she is another possible model for Ophelia that is used by Orthodox scholars to say, look, it's our man, it's our guy. Both of these young women with suitable names drown near Stratford, one of them in the Avon, one of them picking flowers. Perfect. But you have to be careful, and we have to be similarly careful with our own conclusions from things like this, because drowning was the most common cause of death in the period. The very fact that there are 2 of them with suitable names near Stratford-on-Avon drowning should tell you that what we've got here is a case of nominal coincidence, coincidence of name. Neither Shakespeare nor Hamlet were actually uncommon names in the period. So you can see that even when names and an event in a play coincide, they're not necessarily models. the event needs to be unusual. So let's look at another case of nominal coincidence. In 1579, William Shakespeare died by drowning in the River Avon, just 9 miles from Stratford. Okay. Not our guy, or not their guy. Someone else called William Shakespeare died in the River Avon by drowning. Drowning, really, really common. Shakespeare, not an uncommon name.
Spelled that way?
I'd have to look it up, but I do sort of, what I'm doing is not focusing terribly much on the spellings here and just doing fairly standardized spellings. If you see, don't worry about the spelling aspect of it. So nominal coincidence, and I'm going to come back to this quite a lot. Here's one of my favorite, this is like a side issue, but it's a really great example of a nominal coincidence. Arden of Faversham, an anonymous blank verse play published in 1592. Some people have thought that it's got something to do with William Shakespeare, that it's perhaps having a bit of a stab at him. Because in this play, a Mrs. Arden hires 2 villains called Black Will and Shakebag. Now, Arden was Will Shakespeare's mother's maiden name, Mary Arden, right? And obviously you get Will from Black Will and Shakespeare from Shakebag, sounds a bit insulting, they made him into a villain. So I've seen it put forward, this has got something to do with William Shakespeare, but actually there was a real murder on the 14th of February, 1551. The name of the couple really was Arden, it really was a Mrs. Arden who had Mr. Arden murdered by these villains, and the villains were called Black Will and actually Loosebag. But in the 1577 edition of Holinshed's Chronicles, where this was first listed, Loosebag got changed to Shakebag, and this is the source for the person who wrote Arden of Faversham. So another case of nominal coincidence. Right, so back to local knowledge, the next piece of local knowledge we're going to look at. Henry V in Stratford-upon-Avon. Here we have the 1592 list of recusants in Stratford-upon-Avon, that is people who weren't attending church regularly, therefore are suspicious characters. What you can see here, that is Mr. John Shakespeare, that's William Shakespeare's father. And a little further down the list of only 9 names, this is someone called Llewellyn, and this is a guy called Bardolph. Now, this was one of the pieces of evidence that when I first had someone really have a go at me on Twitter. Is an academic from Chichester, and he kept throwing this same thing at me over and over again to basically say, you're wrong, you're wrong, you're wrong. What about Bardolph and Llewellyn in Stratford, eh? Bardolph and Llewellyn in Stratford. And I thought, that's pretty good, right? 'Cause don't they seem really unusual names? Don't they seem really unusual names? And so I thought I'd really better look into this and find out what. Now, one of the things, as I found pretty quickly, is because Bardolph is not the original name of the character that's in the Henry IV plays and Henry V, and was changed afterwards, and we don't know who changed that, right? So if you know that Shakespeare of Stratford is a shareholder, he's involved in the theatre, perhaps, they said this is really embarrassing, you can't call him Russell, because Russell is the name of famous family, so he goes, what shall I do? Well, I'll change it to the name of someone that I know from my old hometown. But there's far better arguments than that one. And that's the point, I think, about taking other people's arguments seriously, because you've got to look for something stronger than that. Llewellyn is actually the anglicised version of the very common Welsh name Llewellyn. So it turns out that's not so weird after all. That's just the way that Llewellyn, was often written down. Bardolph, however, does seem quite striking. So looking into Bardolph, we've got the Stratford Bardolph, 1592 list. His real name is actually Bardell or Bardill. Every other place that it occurs in the records in Stratford is Bardell or Bardill. So it seems that it was written down possibly as a clerical error. I mean, often names are represented differently, but this is the only time it's down there as Bardolph. So it's not the strongest of cases. There is another historical Bardolph who was noted in an article by Newhall in Notes and Queries some time ago. And this is, I think this is fantastic. This is Honfleur Bardolph. In 1428, you have a Johann Bardolph, and he is the man-at-arms serving a Sir John Fastolf. Okay? So the article by Newhall says that somehow or other, the author of these plays found out about this Fastolf and Bardolph, and they changed the Fastolf to Falstaff. And it's interesting as well, because this Bardolph is connected in the records to Talbot. And it's Talbot in Henry VI, Part 1, who's so feared that his name alone causes the enemy to flee. So there's another Shakespearean play connection with this particular Bardolph. But there's yet another one, which Edward Holmes's book put me onto. And he's associated with Who in Kent. And this is the 12th century. There was a Bardolph living there who's connected to a Poins, the original Falstaff, and Gad's Hill, and I'll show you how. Wow. Now, let's be clear that this Bardolph we're talking about in the Henry IV plays is the errant, malmsey-nosed knave. He is Corporal Bardolph, and that's important, as you will see. Some of you already know. He was originally called Sir John Russell, but Sir John Russell was part of the family of the Earls of Bedford. It's not a particularly, what should we say, flattering portrait. So the name was changed sometime between the first performance and the 1598 quarto publication, and we know this because there's an error in the first quarto where the original character name was left in. Okay, but it was changed when the name of Sir John Oldcastle was changed to Sir John Falstaff, for the same reason that the Lord Cobham was the new Oldcastle, and it was an insult to his family. So it looks like these names, and there's another change, that were all changed at the same time. That is going to turn out to be relevant. But it's very peculiar that the Sir John Russell character was renamed Bardolph, because there was already a Bardolph in the play. There's a Lord Bardolph. The Earl of Northumberland and the Lord Bardolph, with the great power of English and of Scots, are by the Shreve of Yorkshire overthrown. This is a historical Bardolph who died along with the Earl of Northumberland, Hotspur's father, at the Battle of Bramham Moor in Henry IV, Part 2. So why would you change a character's name to Bardolph when there's already a Bardolph in the play? Well, let's look at the actual area where this Bardolph lived. In 1408, the real Sir John Oldcastle, the original name of Falstaff, lived here at Cooling Castle. And just right next door, his neighbour, well, there had been a Bardolph at High Halstow, which is about two miles down the road. In the 12th century, and then they had a daughter. There was no male heir. They married into the family Poins. So this land went from Bardolph to Poins. Okay, and you will know all of those names, Bardolph, Poins, and Falstaff. Right at the beginning of Henry IV, Part 1, there's a robbery at Gad's Hill. See how close that is. That's Google Maps taking you by road. That's the bridge that the real Sir John Oldcastle's wife's grandfather built at Rochester. And it says it would take 3 hours, 46 minutes to walk it. It's a lot quicker by horse. It's only 11 miles. And they're on horseback. So you have all of these names associated with this very small area in Kent. There's something else about Poins as well. Poins steals Falstaff's horse, okay? And the real-life Nicholas Poins, the last Poins to live in this area of Who, was a horse stealer. He was a sir, he was a knight, but in the patent rolls he committed numerous thefts, and he stole horses from an abbot, 3 different horses on 3 different occasions. And Falstaff was very upset when Poins, as a sort of joke, steals his horse, hides his horse. So is this a deliberate reference to this notorious Poins who lived in this area? Is it some way of pointing at the original Sir John Oldcastle, so all these names are changed. Points may have been changed at the same time, we don't know. He's the one who is speaking the line using the old names. But there's this disclaimer in the epilogue: Falstaff shall die of a sweat unless already be killed with your hard opinions, for Oldcastle died a martyr, and this is not the man. But it feels like those names were changed at the same time that Oldcastle's name was changed to point towards it being the man, because it does associate with this area. But, there are 3 possible Bardolphs. I'm going to get rid of the Stratford one because his name wasn't Bardolph, it was Bardell. But you've got these 2. I like the Who Kent one. I like it just because it connects in with more points in the plays. But the very fact that you've got 2 and they're both associated with Falstaffs, it's nominal coincidence. Okay. Local knowledge. Let's look at the shrew in Stratford-upon-Avon. The taming of the shrew's induction in the folio, 1623. What would you make me mad? Am I not Christopher Sly, old sly son of Burton Heath, by birth a pedlar, by education a card maker, by transmutation a bear herd, and now by present profession a tinker? Ask Marian Hackett, the fat alewife of Wincott, if she know me not. Now, Marian Hackett, the fat alewife of Wincott, is often thrown at non-Stratfordians as a bit of evidence that the man who wrote the plays is the man from Stratford. And there are 2 possible Wincotts. Now, straight away, right? There's 2 possible Wincotts near Stratford-upon-Avon. Nominal coincidence. So you've got Wilmcott, pronounced Wincott. It was actually spelt Wincott once in the Stratford Corporation records on the 11th of November 1584. That's 4 miles to the north of Stratford-upon-Avon. And then south, about the same distance south, on the border of 2 parishes, Quinton and Clifford Chambers, Sarah, the daughter of Robert Hackett, was baptised in Quinton Church in 1591. So there were Hacketts at or near Wincott. But the real problem is, actually, that my thing's not working properly. The real problem is that no, that's gone now, gone too far. Neither the Wilmcott nor Wincott ever contained an alehouse. So this is Anthony Poynton's work. And what I do with Shakespeare the Evidence is actually try and draw together as much as I can all the good scholarship that's been done by so many different people and kind of put it in bullet-pointed form. But the official history of the parish of Clifford Chambers confirms that Wincott and another hamlet next door, neither of the hamlets has ever included more than a few houses. And despite excavations, no sign of any Wincott alehouse has been found. So, alehouse there. So, you look obviously then for another possible Wincott, and this spelt Wilmcott is actually still pronounced Wincott to this day. It's about 34 miles north of Stratford-upon-Avon, but its relationship to Stratford-on-Avon is not the important thing here really. Let's zoom into that area. There is Wincott down there in the right-hand corner. You see it's very close to Tamworth, it's on the outskirts of Tamworth. And you can also see, perhaps if you're close enough, that is Watling Street. Watling Street, an extremely important Roman road. And there is Watling Street on a map of England. So you can see where Wincott is along there. It's just 13 miles from, oh, and by the way, a bit of Shakespeare Apocrypha, The Widow of Watling Street, supposedly written by W.S. I like the Apocrypha, always fun. So it's just 13 miles from Bosworth Field. So Tamworth is where Richard III stops off on the night before the Battle of Bosworth. Tamworth, Wincott, and Tamworth is absolutely full of Hacketts. If you have a look on the sort of Mormon database of surnames, Hackett is a local name in the 16th century. John Hackett of Tamworth, for example, christened 2 daughters. Sadly, neither of them cook. Haven't managed to find a Marion, but we know the records are incomplete anyway. But there were Hacketts all over Tamworth, and Wincott is right next door. Okay, so that's in 1598, 1599. We know two Hackett daughters being christened, and what's more, Wincott, as it's pronounced, had 5 alehouses, and one of them, now demolished, was occupied by Hacketts. So, Marion Hackett, the fat alewife of Wincott, on Watling Street, in the area which was tramped up and down by those involved in the Wars of the Roses. Okay. And from that, we also come, this same passage has Burton Heath, which Stratfordians will tell you is Barton on the Heath, where Shakespeare's aunt lived. But the text connects Burton Heath with Wincott, does it not? Very close together. So is there another Burton Heath? Well, you can bet your bottom dollar that there is, and that it's just off Watling Street, and in fact it's featured in a play right there. I couldn't even make another dot, because Burton Heath, or Burton Heath in the local accent, is so close to Dunsmore that on this scale that it couldn't get a different dot. And in Henry VI, Part 3, we'll have a look at it on the closer map. Here it is. It's not labelled, but that's Straight Mile Road. You can find that in the records. It's a straight mile across Burton Heath. And it was here, you'll like this bit, I know you will. It was here that John de Vere, the 13th Earl of Oxford, gathered his troops to march down Watling Street and fight for the king at the Battle of Barnet in Henry VI, Part 3. Now, this isn't proof that his great-grandson wrote the plays. This is just historical accuracy on the part of Shakespeare. Nevertheless, you have Burton Heath on the same road as Wincott that has a Hackett and, alehouse. Hackett's in the alehouse. So finally, I'm going to take you to something that kind of is brand new, is mine. Because what happens in Shakespeare the Evidence is I'm mostly putting together everyone else's research, and then every now and then I find something myself, and that goes in. So it's all small stuff, but I particularly like this. So Henry VI, Part 2, all these the Henry plays, originally published as the first part of the Contention, 1594 and 1600. And in it, it's got a character called Jack Cade. And in the source, which is Hall's Chronicles, Jack Cade is an Irishman. But in Act 3, Scene 1 of Henry VI, Part 2, he's described as a headstrong Kentish man, John Cade of Ashford. Now, one of the most interesting avenues for non-Stratfordians, I think, is to explore, as Eddie has done, to explore where Shakespeare differs from his sources. How close is he to source, and where has he changed the sources? And here we have a peculiar change related to Jack Cade. Why has he made him a Kentishman? And there's more, because in Act 4, Scene 2, Dick, the butcher of Ashford, says, and he's actually, that's his name, if you know the text, he's Dick the butcher of Ashford. He says, the field is honourable, and there was he born, he's talking about Jack Cade, under a hedge, for his father never had a house but the cage. Now, if you look in any edition of Shakespeare, any normal edited edition, the cage will have a small c, okay, and it will be glossed. It will be glossed as a small lockup, a small pen, a prison, yeah? So imagine my delight. I mean, one of the things that Richard Rowe's book taught us is to pay attention to capitalization. In the original text, in the folio text and in the two-quarto text, the cage has got a capital C, suggesting an actual place. So imagine my delight to discover that there was, in fact, a 16th century structure in Ashford known as the Cage. It was under this building, number 1, Middle Row, Ashford, which in the 16th century was part of the Market Hall. And if you were a bad boy, they'd put you in the Cage. It was notorious in Ashford. It was a tiny cell in the cellar, a very unpleasant place with a reputation. It's mentioned in local documents of the 16th and early 17th centuries. And here it is in 3D. You can imagine how small this is. You couldn't stand up in it. It's not a nice place to be put. These drawings and this photograph were in a paper, in a very obscure paper by one W.R. Briscoe of the Canterbury Archaeological Society. He has made no connection at all with the Ashford Cage mentioned in Henry VI, Part 2, and why should he? He's not a Shakespeare scholar, he's an archaeologist. but that he has found the Ashford Cage that Shakespeare mentioned. So now it has been posited for several decades that Christopher Marlowe, a Kentish man himself, wrote certain scenes in Henry VI, Part 2. This is a Kentish joke for Kentish folk. It has not been noticed by any previous scholar. It's not actually the only part of the Shakespeare canon that contains strong Kent references, to the point that Sylvia Morris, on her Shakespeare blog in November 2012, she's noticed that Jack Cade's been made into a Kentish man instead of an Irish man. And then she looks at, you can go and have a look at her article, she looks at some other aspects of Kent connected to Lear, you know, the famous Kent cliffs in Lear, and she says, why was Kent such an important county to Shakespeare? Now, the answer is not to appropriate the Marlowe canon and say that the Earl of Oxford wrote that too, all right? Marlowe does not have the same biographical issues that the man from Stratford has, but what this does require of us is a degree of uncertainty. And I'm talking about removing that piece, not putting it in. Okay? And this uncertainty will make better scholars of all of us. And it will make it far, far more likely that we will in due course make the authorship question acceptable in academia, because with uncertainty, we can really drill down into the other side's arguments, looking at, well, is that right? Is that right? What can I find to counter that? And in doing so, find really interesting little tidbits that are actually of interest to mainstream scholars. Like, I can publish this, you know? So it's all about that, trying to get taken more seriously. Uncertainty is absolutely necessary. So thank you so much for listening. If you want more of the same, do have a look at leanpub.com. Shakespeare is where you find Shakespeare the Evidence. So there's a few postcards outside, but I think most of them have gone. There's a free sample so you can see how it's structured and things. Thank you so much for listening. I'll see you over to questions.